They want me to sell the company. If we don't hit our revenue target in 90 days, the board forces a sale.
What about your father?
He put nearly his entire retirement into the stock. If it collapses, he loses everything.
So, why tell me?
No blazer armor, no clipped CEO voice that once silenced entire boardrooms. For the first time in 2 years as neighbors, he understands her perfect composure was always just armor. Stay to find out how deep tonight's secret is about to pull him in. This Sunday, my parents' barbecue on Mercer Island. I need you to come with me. I nearly dropped the hose. 2 years of living next door to Elena Voss, and that was the first full sentence she had ever said to me that didn't involve a property line, a parking spot, or the recycling bins rolling into the wrong yard again. It was a Friday evening in Fremont, the kind where the light turns gold around 6 and just sits there warm and lazy until almost 8. I was doing what I do every Friday, watering the lavender hedge between our two houses on North 45th Street. Miss Betty, 2 doors down, waved at me from her porch swing, the same swing that's been creaking the exact same creak since 1987, the year her husband built it with his own 2 hands. I waved back. Ordinary. Quiet. Nothing about that evening should have gone sideways. Then Elena's front door opened. Not the woman I was used to seeing, the one in a black blazer at 6 in the morning, laptop bag over one shoulder, engine already running before she'd even said good morning. This Elena wore a soft cream sweater, her bob a little wild instead of combed flat, and her eyes were red-rimmed in a way that could have meant crying or could have meant no sleep at all. With Elena, I never could tell which. She stopped exactly 2 feet away from me. I noticed that the precise distance, like she'd measured it in her head, and said the sentence again, slower, the way you'd read aloud something you'd already signed. I should have said no. 2 years since my divorce, and I had trained myself to say no to anything that came wrapped in someone else's family. No to setups, no to just come meet everyone, no to casseroles left on my porch with a phone number tucked under the foil. I had gotten very good at closing doors before they even opened all the way. But there was something in how she asked, no please, no explanation, just a flat, bare request, like she expected the whole world to simply agree with her, that made me nod before I'd finished thinking it through. She didn't say thank you. That's the part that stayed with me longest. She just turned already halfway back toward her door and added over her shoulder, 11 o'clock sharp, wear whatever, just don't look like you're heading into a job interview. Then she was gone, the door clicking shut. And I stood there holding a hose that was still running quietly over my own shoes. I thought about the flat tire. 2 weeks before that had been the only real conversation we'd ever had, her car dead in the driveway at 11 at night, me coming out in sweatpants with a jack and a flashlight, the two of us trading maybe 40 words the whole time. She'd said thank you that night, just not tonight. On my kitchen counter sat a letter from the school district I still hadn't opened. Vice Principal, it said above my name, typed neat and official, gathering coffee rings for over a month now. Every time I walked past it, I told myself, tomorrow. On my wrist, my father's old watch sat frozen at 3:17, had been for years. I still wore it. Some habits outlive the reasons we started them. Through her car window at the curb, I caught a glimpse of Elena's brown leather notebook lying open on the passenger seat. The last page turned up, though I was too far away to read a single word. She carried that notebook everywhere she went. I had never once seen what was inside it. I thought, too, of the small orange pill bottle I'd noticed on her windowsill the night of the flat tire, still sealed, untouched, and how her phone, even now behind that closed door, would stay lit until 2 in the morning, always on silent, never once ringing out loud for anyone to hear. The lavender hedge between our 2 front yards was mine. I'd planted it the week I moved in, telling myself it was for the bees. If I'm honest, it was a border. A polite, fragrant way of saying, stay on your side. In the bottom drawer of my desk, under a stack of graded essays on the Treaty of Versailles, there's an old photograph of my ex-wife and me at Green Lake, both of us laughing at something I can no longer remember. I've moved that drawer twice since the divorce and never once opened the photograph to look at it. I've also never once thrown it away. 2 years, and Elena had never once asked my name. If she needed to call me anything at all, she called me the teacher, said the way other people say the mailman or the guy with the good lavender. I went back inside that night and turned the letter from the district face down on the counter the way you'd turn down a card you weren't ready to play yet. Then I sat on my own front steps for a long while listening to Miss Betty's porch swing creak its same old rhythm, and I wondered, not for the first time, but for the first time in a long while, what exactly it was I'd been protecting myself from all this time. Which made it stranger still that 2 days from now, that same woman would introduce me to 20 relatives as something I had never agreed to be. I didn't know that yet, standing there in wet shoes with a warm hose handle in my hand. I only knew that something had shifted some small hinge in the ordinary machinery of my Fridays, and that I had just said yes to a door I should have left shut. The coldest woman on North 45th Street had just asked me to a family barbecue, and nothing about my life was going to stay in my own hands after that. Sunday, 10:45 in the morning. I pulled up in front of Elena's house, and she was already standing at the curb waiting in a simple white linen dress, her makeup light, almost none at all. I remember thinking she looked younger like that, softer, like someone I hadn't actually met yet. We crossed the I-90 bridge in near total silence, the water below us catching the morning sun in long silver streaks. Somewhere past the floating bridge, she finally spoke. "My family has a lot of opinions," she said, eyes on the windshield. "You don't have to say much." I almost asked what that meant. I didn't get the chance. As we came up on the Mercer Island exit, she turned to me suddenly. A question dropped out of nowhere. "Do you ever worry about being looked at like an outsider?" It was such an odd thing to ask that I nearly answered honestly. I nearly told her about faculty meetings, about holidays with my ex-wife's family after the divorce, about how outsider had been my default setting for 2 straight years. Instead, I just said, "Sometimes," and she nodded like that was the answer she'd expected. The Voss house sat up on a hillside overlooking Lake Washington, the kind of view real estate agents call unobstructed and charge an extra $100,000 for. More than 20 people were already out on the lawn, laughter carrying down toward the water. Margaret Voss opened the door before we even reached it. She was small, silver-haired, her whole face lighting up the second she saw me standing behind Elena. Here is where I want to say I saw it coming. I didn't. Elena reached over and took my hand the first time she had ever touched me on purpose in 2 years, and said it clearly, without a flicker of hesitation, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "This is my boyfriend, Daniel Hayes." I went completely still. Blood rushed up into my face so fast I could feel my own pulse in my ears. My mouth opened. Nothing came out. Nobody in that yard thought to ask whether I had agreed to any of it. An aunt shrieked with delight. "Finally, someone!" A young cousin clapped me on the shoulder. "You look trustworthy, man." Robert, Elena's father, only nodded once slowly, his eyes doing something closer to an audit than a greeting. He shook my hand a beat too long, like he was testing the weight of it before he said, quiet enough that only I could hear, "She hasn't brought anyone home since business school." I was pulled into hug after hug, asked what I did for work, told that a history teacher must have the patience of a saint. Someone put a plate of ribs in my hand before I'd said 10 words. A cousin's kid, maybe 6 years old, tugged on my sleeve and asked if I knew any dinosaurs. And for one strange, warm second, standing in a stranger's backyard, holding a plate I hadn't asked for, none of it felt like a lie at all. It felt like Sunday. It felt like a family. And I hadn't stood inside one of those in a long time. Every single time I opened my mouth to correct the record, Elena caught my eye first, a silent, pleading look that swallowed the words right back down my throat. By the third time, I stopped trying. I told myself it was easier this way. For one afternoon, for her grandmother's sake, I didn't yet understand how much easier that excuse would keep getting. Standing in that yard, smiling at strangers who already loved me for a role I hadn't auditioned for, I understood something I hadn't wanted to look at directly. I said yes to being someone's rescue too easily. I always had long before the divorce, because being needed felt safer than being chosen, and far safer than wanting something out loud where it could be refused. What I feared wasn't the lie itself, it was what correcting it might cost me, reminding a whole yard and myself that no one had picked me first in a long time. So I stayed quiet, not for Elena's grandmother, but for the small, dangerous comfort of being useful again. By afternoon, Margaret pulled me aside to a quiet corner of the yard, away from the noise, and took both my hands in hers. Her grip was steadier than I expected for a woman her age. Her voice shook with something that sounded almost like relief. "Grandson," she said, "I have been waiting a very long time for this day." Then she reached into her cardigan pocket and brought out a silver bracelet, worn smooth with age, and clasped it onto Elena's wrist right there in front of everyone. "Keep this on," she said, loud enough for the whole family to hear. "There's someone beside you now. I can rest easy." Elena's face went pale for exactly 1 second, long enough that I caught it, though I don't think anyone else did. Her free hand tightened around that brown leather notebook until her knuckles went white. An aunt was already talking about wedding seating charts. Someone mentioned a color palette for flowers, lavender, and cream, and laughed that it was practically a sign given the hedge Elena had told them about once in passing years ago. Nobody in that yard doubted a single word of it. I felt it settle over me slowly, like weather changing. This wasn't just a role I'd been pulled into for an afternoon. An entire family had just quietly sealed off every exit, one bracelet, one toast, one hopeful aunt at a time, and none of them had any idea they were doing it. Later, packing up folding chairs as the sun dropped low over the lake, I caught Margaret watching Elena from across the yard, not with suspicion, but with something closer to hunger, the particular hunger of someone counting the Sundays she has left. I didn't know that detail yet. I only felt it, the way you feel weather before it arrives. The drive home was silent again, all the way across the bridge until we were nearly at the midpoint over the water. That's when Elena finally spoke, her voice small in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "My grandmother doesn't have much time left," she said. "I didn't know any other way to do this." I didn't answer. I was thinking about the unopened letter on my counter, about a watch stuck at 3:17. About how I had lost some control over my own life the moment I'd nodded at a hose running over my shoes 2 days earlier. I thought I understood that night exactly what I'd walked into. I was wrong. I had only seen the first layer of it. Because a family that loves you enough to hand you an heirloom bracelet within 4 hours of meeting you is not a family that lets go easily. And a woman who can say, "This is my boyfriend," without blinking, is not a woman who says things she hasn't already calculated 3 moves ahead. I didn't know yet what those calculations were protecting. I only knew driving home over dark water with a stranger who was suddenly wearing my name like a shield, that whatever came next was going to cost one of us something we couldn't easily get back. When I dropped her off, she paused at her own front door, hand on the frame, and looked back at me like she wanted to say something more. She didn't. She just nodded once, the same flat, businesslike nod she gave people in meetings, and went inside. I sat in my driveway with the engine off, in no hurry to go inside. Through my windshield, I watched the bracelet catch the porch light on her wrist as she disappeared behind the door. A small, bright thing, heavier than silver has any right to be. Elena just called Daniel her boyfriend in front of her entire family without asking him first. Team Elena, a dying grandmother's peace of mind justifies the lie. Team Daniel, nothing justifies deciding for someone else without their consent. Comment your team below. Choose now. Part 3. Changes everything. 3 nights after the barbecue, I heard a soft knock at my door at 11:07 p.m. I'd just finished grading a stack of essays on the Treaty of Versailles when I heard it, not the sharp, businesslike knock I'd expect from Elena Voss, but something smaller, almost apologetic. She was sitting on my front steps when I opened the door, not standing, not waiting to be invited in. No makeup, hair loose and uncombed, eyes rimmed red in that same way from 5 days earlier, except this time I didn't have to wonder which kind of red it was. She didn't waste time on hello. "They want me to sell the company," she said. "The board. If we don't hit our revenue target in 90 days, they force a sale. My father put almost his entire retirement into Lumina Forge stock. If it goes under, he loses everything." I sat down beside her on the cold concrete step. And for the first time in 2 years, something in me finally understood the boyfriend performance wasn't only for a dying grandmother's peace of mind. It was armor. The last piece of armor keeping her family from seeing that their brilliant daughter, their unshakable CEO, was quietly failing in front of everyone who loved her. She pulled out her phone and showed me a message from a board member, cold, clinical, the kind of language people use specifically so they can't be quoted saying something cruel. I read it twice before I could make my mouth form a response. By the end of that week, I had agreed to help her restructure her leadership team. We worked through the whole weekend at my kitchen table, a small whiteboard, a set of dry erase markers, an org chart drawn and redrawn until midnight both nights. For the first time since I'd known her, she let me see the real chaos underneath the composure. Half her department heads were burned out. A quarter of her engineering team had 1 foot out the door already. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in over a month. I found somewhere around Saturday at 1 a.m. that I didn't mind any of it. That should have told me something. She fell asleep at my kitchen table that night, chin resting on her folded arms, marker still loose in her hand. And I sat across from her for longer than I should have, just watching the way her shoulders finally dropped from around her ears. I didn't wake her. I got the throw blanket off my couch instead, the ugly plaid one my mother gave me the Christmas after the divorce, and draped it over her shoulders before I turned off the kitchen light. She never knew I did that. I never told her. Sunday morning, she made coffee in my kitchen like she'd done it 100 times before. Found the mugs on the second try and didn't ask where anything was. I remember standing in the doorway in my socks, watching her and thinking that this is the quiet, unremarkable domesticity of 2 people fixing a company's org chart over burnt coffee felt more like the truth of something than the whole performance at her parents' house ever had. Monday morning, the principal called me into his office. A parent had sent an email with photos attached. Elena and me walking around Green Lake sometime over that same restructuring weekend, taking a break to clear our heads between whiteboard sessions. An errand that had felt like nothing at the time. Now it was a printed exhibit sitting on my principal's desk. Rumors were already moving through the building faster than any lesson plan I'd ever taught. "Is there something going on, Mr. Hayes?" the principal asked, not quite a question, "between you and a tech CEO with this much public visibility?" Because parents are asking, and it's the kind of thing that affects how the district sees you for that vice principal position. I sat there with my hands folded, thinking about the letter still face down on my kitchen counter, the one I'd been too afraid to open for over a month, and realized the decision I'd been avoiding had just been made partly for me. Whatever I said next in that office could cost me the one part of my career I had actually built with my own 2 hands, brick by brick, over 11 years. "There's nothing inappropriate happening," I told him, which was true in every way that mattered and somehow still felt like a lie leaving my mouth. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've decided to believe you for now, and reminded me that the district committee met in 3 weeks to finalize the vice principal recommendation, and that optics, unfortunately, mattered as much as merit. I walked back to my classroom, past 2 colleagues who stopped talking the second they saw me, the particular silence of people who'd just been discussing you. That evening, Elena came to my door again. This time, she didn't sit on the steps. She stood in my doorway holding a manila folder, and when she opened it, I saw a buyout contract, a number circled at the bottom, large enough to cover her father's entire retirement fund, and then some. She looked at me and said it plainly, the same flat, businesslike tone she'd used the day she first asked me to the barbecue. "I just need you to keep playing the part for 2 more weeks, until the board meeting. They need to see I have a stable life. After that—" She paused, just barely. "You can disappear." Elena wasn't cruel, she was drowning, and her real fear had never been the company. It was proving her father right, forever doubting she could hold anything together alone, which was why a placeholder boyfriend was so much safer to lose than an admission of that. That single word disappear cost her nothing because to her I had always been a solution with an expiration date, never a person she'd let herself actually want. For me it cost everything because I had mistaken being useful for being chosen, the same mistake that ended my marriage. And hearing it named out loud finally was what stopped me from swallowing my own voice for her sake. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just looked at her, really. Look the way you look at someone when you're trying to decide if you ever actually knew them at all. So that's what I am, I finally said. A placeholder, with an end date. She flinched. It was small, barely there, a tightening around her eyes before the composure slid back into place. That's not, she started, then stopped herself because we both knew there wasn't a version of that sentence that made it not true. I thought about the school hallway that morning. The sideways looks from colleagues who'd never once looked at me sideways in 11 years. I thought about the vice principal letter still unopened, still gathering coffee rings, now potentially gone entirely because of a walk around a lake I hadn't thought twice about at the time. I had spent 2 years building a quiet, careful, controllable life after my divorce. Small, safe, entirely my own. In 4 days, a woman who had never once asked my name had put my career, my reputation, and apparently my heart on a timeline that ended the moment her board meeting did. 2 weeks, I said finally, my voice flatter than I meant it to be. And then I disappear. She nodded, and for 1/2 second something crossed her face that looked almost like regret. Then the folder closed and the CEO was back, already halfway down my porch steps, already thinking 3 moves ahead to a meeting that hadn't happened yet. I stood in my doorway for a moment after she'd gone, the manila folder's shape still burned into my memory. Then I went inside and sat down at the same kitchen table where she'd fallen asleep 2 nights before. I opened the desk drawer without quite deciding, to the one under a stack of graded essays, and for the first time in months I actually looked at the photograph, instead of just knowing it was there. My ex-wife and me at Green Lake, both of us laughing. I wasn't aching over her anymore. I was recognizing something. I had done this before. Let someone need me until there was nothing left of me to need, and called it love because that was easier than calling it what it actually was. I closed the drawer. I was not going to let it happen twice. I told myself I would end it that night. I got my keys off the hook by the door, the same hook that still held a spare key to a house my ex-wife hadn't lived in for 2 years, and I drove the 10 minutes to Elena Street with the windows down, rehearsing the 2 words I planned to say the second she opened her door. I'm done. I just didn't know yet that the ending waiting for me at her house wasn't the one I had rehearsed the whole drive over. I pulled up in front of Elena's house a little before midnight, still rehearsing those 2 words in my head, still certain I knew exactly how the next 5 minutes were going to go. Her porch light was on. So was her living room. I could see shapes moving behind the curtain, and for a second I thought she must still be awake, working, the way she always seemed to be at that hour. When she opened the door, though, it wasn't Elena's face I braced for. Margaret Voss was sitting on the living room sofa, hands folded neatly in her lap like she'd been waiting there for exactly this moment. She'd driven in from Mercer Island, unannounced, no warning, no phone call. Elena stood frozen a few feet away from her, the color drained clean out of her face. I stood in the doorway, unable to make my legs carry me either forward or back. Somewhere behind me out on the street I could hear my own car engine still ticking as it cooled the only ordinary sound left in a night that had stopped making sense the second I saw her sitting there. Elena's brown leather notebook sat closed on the coffee table in front of Margaret, and I remember thinking absurdly that I still didn't know what was written inside it, and that I might never find out now because whatever was about to happen in this room felt bigger than a notebook, bigger than a secret, bigger than anything either of us had planned for. Margaret looked at me first, then at Elena. Then she spoke quietly, but with a clarity that filled the entire room. I've known it was a performance since the very first afternoon. Neither of us moved. The air went thick, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your chest instead of just filling your ears. I braced myself for anger. I braced for grief, for betrayal, for the particular fury of a woman who'd handed over her mother's silver bracelet to a lie. What came instead was almost worse because it was gentle. "I'm not upset," Margaret said, her pale blue eyes moving between the two of us. "I watched the way you looked at her, Daniel, when she thought no one was paying attention. And I watched the way she looked at you the same way that Sunday at the barbecue, every single time you turned your back to talk to someone else. I didn't need the performance to see what was real underneath it. I only worried that if I said something too soon, the two of you would run from the shame of being caught instead of staying long enough to find out what was true." She paused, and for a moment her hands trembled slightly in her lap, the only sign of how much this was costing her, too. "I am 74 years old. I have watched enough people mistake fear for wisdom to know the difference now. I did not want that mistake to be the last thing I saw my granddaughter make." Elena's mouth opened, some protest half-formed, some old reflex to explain herself, to manage the moment the way she managed everything. Nothing came out. For possibly the first time in her adult life, Elena Voss had no argument ready. For 2 years I had built a life around never being fully known, because in my experience, being known was only ever the first step toward being left. What I wanted underneath all of it was exactly what Margaret had just done to me, to be seen completely and not run from. But I had never once believed it was safe to ask for that out loud. She hadn't confronted us to punish anyone. She'd waited more patiently than I deserved for both of us to be brave enough to stop hiding behind a role neither of us had wanted in the first place. That patience was the thing that finally broke me open, because you cannot keep building a wall against someone who refuses to attack it. Elena made a sound I'd never heard from her before. Not a sob exactly. Something rawer than that, torn loose from somewhere she usually kept locked. She sank down onto the arm of the sofa, both hands pressed over her face, and for the first time in 2 years of knowing her, I watched every last piece of composure leave her body at once. Margaret reached out and took my hand in one of hers and Elena's hand in the other and pressed them together, one stacked over the other, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. "Stop using fear as your reason," she said softly. "Both of you. That's all I ask." Nobody said anything for what felt like several minutes. I sat down on the sofa beside Elena, close enough that our shoulders touched and neither of us pulled away. Margaret rose slowly, smoothed her cardigan, and said she'd take the guest room for the night, the way she always used to when Elena was small, and left the two of us alone. With a silence that felt, for the first time in months, honest, instead of strategic. Elena wiped her face with the back of her hand, an oddly childlike gesture from a woman who ran board meetings for a living, and said so quietly I almost missed it, "I don't know how to do this without a plan." "I know," I said. And I did know, because I'd spent 2 years building the exact same kind of armor, just made of different material. Mine was silence and a lavender hedge. Hers was spreadsheets and a closed notebook. But underneath it was the same wall, built for the same reason. 2 days later, Margaret died in her sleep peacefully at her home on Mercer Island. Elena's father found her Tuesday morning, still in the reading chair by her bedroom window, a paperback open on her lap to a page she'd never finish. The funeral was held that Saturday at a small church not far from the house on the hill, the same lawn where 20 relatives had once cheered at the news of a boyfriend who didn't exist. This time, the same lawn held folding chairs in long, quiet rows, and nobody was laughing. Someone had set out a table with photographs, Margaret as a young bride, Margaret holding a baby who would grow up to be Robert, Margaret at 80% of every birthday party this family had ever thrown. I stood in front of that table longer than I meant to, struck by how much of an entire life fits onto one folding table when it has to. Elena wore the silver bracelet. I noticed it the second she walked in, catching the light exactly the way it had at the barbecue, except now it meant something entirely different. Not a leash, not a role assigned to her by a hopeful grandmother, but the only piece of Margaret she could carry on her wrist and still function through the day. At the reception afterward, one of the aunts, the same one who'd shrieked with delight months before, pulled Elena aside and asked gently, careful with her grief, whether there'd been any talk yet of a wedding date. Elena didn't answer. She reached over and took my hand instead, held it tight enough that I felt it in my knuckles, and said nothing at all. I stood there holding her hand in front of a church full of people who still believed in a story that had never technically been true. And I understood that the hand-holding wasn't performance anymore. It wasn't for her father or her aunts or anyone's peace of mind. It was the only steady thing left in a room full of loss, and neither of us was ready yet to let go of it, even though neither of us knew what came next. I thought about Margaret's letter, not a literal one, not yet, just her words from 2 nights before, still echoing. Stop using fear as your reason. I looked down at our hands, still joined, and I understood for the first time that I was standing at a fork in a road I hadn't chosen to be on, and that one direction led backward, toward the careful, controllable life I'd built after my divorce, and the other led somewhere I had no map for at all. I didn't know standing on that lawn in a borrowed sense of grief that had somehow become entirely my own, which direction I was going to choose. I only knew that for the first time in 2 years I wanted to choose one at all. We never made any announcement to the Voss family. There was no conversation, no declaration, nothing that would have sounded right so soon after a funeral. We just quietly started appearing together less, and then slowly drifted back toward the careful distance we'd kept for 2 years before any of this began. Lumina Forge downsized almost exactly the way we'd sketched it out on my kitchen whiteboard. That weekend, some people left, some stayed. The org chart finally matching the company that actually existed, instead of the one everyone had been pretending still did. The company survived. Elena did too, though she wasn't the untouchable CEO people had built her up to be anymore. She was something quieter, someone who occasionally answered emails a day late and didn't apologize for it. I found that whiteboard still leaning against my pantry door weeks later. Half the ink faded, the last diagram we'd drawn together still legible if you squinted. I almost erased it a dozen times. I never did. I turned down the vice principal position with a short, polite email. The same letter I'd left face down on my counter for over a month finally answered, though not in the way anyone had expected. It was the first time in years I'd said no to something, not out of fear, but because I'd finally figured out what I actually wanted, and it wasn't a title with more meetings and less classroom. One afternoon, weeks after the funeral, I looked up from watering the lavender hedge and saw Elena standing on her side of it, looking over at my house, at me at the hedge itself, like she was trying to work out whether it was still a border or something else now. She didn't cross it. I didn't open my door and wave her over either. We just looked at each other for a few seconds, the way you look at someone you're not quite done with yet, and then we both went back inside. I told myself that was probably how it would end. 2 people who had helped each other through something hard, gone back now to their separate, orderly lives the way most things quietly resolve themselves once the crisis that created them has passed. There was a strange, false comfort in that thought. It felt safe. It felt, in its own quiet way, like something I had chosen instead of something that had simply happened to me. Miss Betty caught me on my porch a few evenings later, her swing creaking its same familiar rhythm, and asked, without much ceremony, whatever happened to that nice young woman from next door. I told her it was complicated. She raised an eyebrow, the particular eyebrow of a woman who has outlived 3 complicated things herself, and said only, "Complicated usually just means somebody's scared, Daniel." Then she went back to her crossword like she hadn't just handed me something I'd be turning over in my head for days. Her grandson was visiting that week, 7 years old and loud about everything, and he'd nicknamed her ancient upright vacuum Old Rory for the noise it made, dragging it around her living room like a parade float, while Miss Betty laughed so hard she had to sit down. I stood there on my own porch, listening to that laughter drift across 2 yards, and thought, not for the first time, how much ordinary life kept right on happening. Appointments and vacuum cleaners and crosswords, even while a person's whole understanding of themselves was quietly rearranging itself somewhere underneath it. 3 weeks after that conversation, on a gray, rain-heavy afternoon in October, my phone rang. A downtown Seattle number I didn't recognize. It was a lawyer's office. Margaret's estate attorney, calling from an office near 4th Avenue, said there was a sealed envelope Margaret had left specifically for me. Not for Elena, not for the family at large, just for me, with instructions that it only be delivered once the estate had fully settled. I sat with the phone still in my hand long after the call ended, rain streaking down my kitchen window. The same window where I used to see Elena's lit bedroom on the nights she couldn't sleep. Whatever Margaret had left me, she had clearly thought about it carefully. She'd had 90 days to write something quick and sentimental, and she hadn't. She'd waited until the dust from everything, the buyout, the board meeting, the funeral itself had fully settled before letting her words reach me at all. I found myself standing at my window that whole afternoon, watching the rain fall on the lavender hedge, gone dormant now for the season, its silver-green leaves beaded with water. I thought about the 2 feet of distance Elena had always kept between us the first night she asked me to the barbecue. I thought about a bracelet, a notebook I'd never once seen inside of, and a woman who'd looked at both of us across her own living room and refused to let fear make our decisions for us any longer. I didn't know yet what Margaret's letter would say. I only knew standing at that window with the phone finally back in my pocket that I had spent 2 careful years building a life with no room in it for surprises, and that the last surprise this family had left behind wasn't finished with me yet. I made an appointment for that Thursday afternoon downtown at an office on a street I'd never had a reason to visit before. I put on the watch that still read 3:17 out of habit more than anything, and caught myself, hand on the door, wondering for the first time in years whether it was finally time to get it fixed instead of just wearing the reminder of when it had stopped. I didn't tell Elena. Some part of me wanted to keep this one thing separate, unshared, mine alone, for just a little while longer. I don't think I fully understood yet, standing in my driveway under a sky still heavy with rain, that whatever came out of that envelope was never going to belong to just me at all. I sat in a small conference room at the lawyer's office, my hands not quite steady, and opened an envelope the color of old cream. Margaret's handwriting filled the page, small and careful. The handwriting of a woman who'd written a great many thank you notes in her life and never once rushed one. Daniel, I know you'll be reading this after I'm gone. I never believed the performance for one single afternoon. I only ever believed in the way the 2 of you looked at each other when you thought no one else was watching. The bracelet I gave her was never meant to hold anyone in place. It was meant to remind her that some things are only real once every false reason for them has been taken away. There is no sick grandmother now. No company on the edge of collapse. No performance left to keep up for anyone's sake but your own. If you still want to stay beside her, Daniel, stay because of you. If you don't, then let go. Honestly, the way I never got the chance to teach either of you to do sooner. I only ask that you both stop using fear as your reason. Margaret, I read it twice. Outside the window, rain kept falling steadily onto 4th Avenue, the same gray rain that had followed me since the phone call 3 weeks earlier. Every single thing that had happened since that Friday evening with the hose still running over my shoes, the sudden introduction, the bracelet, the scandal at school, the folder with a number circled at the bottom, the tears on my own front steps, all of it, I understood now, had only ever been the scaffolding around this one true thing Margaret had seen from the very beginning. I didn't call anyone. I got in my car and drove straight back to Fremont, through the rain wipers working hard against a downpour that showed no signs of letting up. Elena was sitting on my front steps when I pulled into the driveway, soaked through, her brown leather notebook held against her chest like something she was protecting from the weather. She didn't ask why I'd gone downtown without telling her. She didn't ask anything at all. I sat down beside her on the wet concrete. The same steps where she'd first told me about the board, about her father's retirement, about a lie that had started as protection and slowly become something neither of us knew how to put down. I didn't say we're real. I didn't say I forgive you. There was nothing left in either of us that needed forgiving, not really, not anymore. I just handed her the letter. She read it slowly, rain dripping from her hair onto the page, and when she finished, she cried. Not the frightened, cornered crying I'd seen the night Margaret confronted us, but something quieter, something that had finally found a place to land. Then, without a word, she opened the brown leather notebook, the one I'd wondered about for 2 years, and turned it toward me. Page after page of my name, small observations in tight, careful handwriting, the lavender watered at the same hour every Friday, a line about the flat tire, half a sentence crossed out a dozen different ways, like she'd been trying for months to say something out loud she'd only ever managed on paper. There was no secret in it. There never had been. I started taking the anxiety medication again this week, she added quietly, nodding toward the small orange bottle now open on her windowsill instead of sealed shut. Didn't need the company crisis as an excuse for that either, it turns out. We sat there a long time in the rain, saying nothing. No performance left standing between us. No lie either of us was keeping up for anyone's sake. Just two people who had each spent years afraid of exactly this moment being fully seen, with no excuse left to hide behind, finally looking straight at each other instead of away. At some point she reached over without a word and rested her hand on top of mine on the wet concrete step, the same way Margaret had once stacked our hands together in her living room. This time nobody was holding them there for us. We were choosing it ourselves. Across the yard, the lavender hedge stood dark and dripping in the last of the evening light, no longer a border, no longer anything meant to keep either of us out. I noticed for the first time that some of it had grown clean over the property line months ago, roots tangled somewhere underneath the ground where neither of us had been paying attention. It had simply grown that way on its own, the way real things do when nobody's managing them. I didn't pull back. For the first time in 2 years, with every shield I owned taken cleanly out of my hands, I chose to stay. This story reminds us that the people who love us best rarely ask us to be stronger, braver, or some more finished version of ourselves. They ask us to stop hiding, which is a far harder thing. If you've spent years managing your grief instead of feeling it, staying busy, staying composed, washing and returning the casserole dish before anyone can ask how you're really doing, you already know how much energy that takes, and you already know it isn't healing. It's just very organized avoidance. So here is something smaller and more specific than stay strong. Tonight, before you turn off the porch light, call one person, not to catch up on the week, but to say one true thing you haven't said out loud yet. Maybe it's, I still set out 2 coffee cups most mornings without thinking. Maybe it's, I haven't figured out how to watch the Sunday game alone yet. Say the true thing and let the silence on the other end sit there uncomfortably for a second. That discomfort is the sound of a wall coming down. And if a grandchild calls you on FaceTime this week, resist the urge to only ask about grades or work. Ask one real question about what they're afraid of instead, and actually wait through the pause for their answer. Letting someone else be known back to you is often the fastest way to remember you still know how to do it yourself. Healing was never about becoming someone new. It's about letting the people already in your life, the neighbor whose porch swing you can hear from your kitchen, the grandchild on the screen, the friend who still says your husband's name without you having to bring it up first. See you exactly as tired, exactly as unfinished, and exactly as real as you actually are tonight. Human writers poured their heart into these stories to expose injustice and honor real humanity. AI served only as a technical supporter refining expression. So the valuable lessons of equality, humility, and hope in everyday family life could inspire millions.